Mr. and Mrs. Lingwood were informed that their 8-year-old son must not tax his heart. Indeed, he must not lift himself from the bed, and he must move very mindfully. Luckily, a passion for reading transported him around the world in 7,000 pages. When he was 15, boarding in Torquay and working at a coal merchant's, Dennis borrowed Madame Blavatsky's weighty volumes from the public library and, having read each one twice, had an awakening.
Stimulated as I was by their immense wealth of information on every conceivable aspect of philosophy, comparative religion, occultism, mysticism, science, and 100 other subjects, the realization which dawned most clearly upon me was the fact that I was not a Christian, that I never had been and never would be, and that the whole structure of Christian doctrine was from beginning to end thoroughly repugnant to me. This realization gave me a sense of relief, of liberation as from some oppressive burden, which was so great that I wanted to dance and sing for joy.
I think we need a much greater emphasis on the Bodhisattva ideal. I've mentioned time and again that, in a way, the whole movement is a sort of embodiment of that 11-headed and 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. It's not just a question of ourselves going for refuge, not just a question of developing ourselves. It's also a question of looking to other people, making the Dharma available to them and helping them, especially fellow order members, in whatever way we can.
At the time of its 20th anniversary, Sangharakshita had personally ordained over 300 members into the Western Buddhist order. On his arrival in England in August 1964, Sangharakshita had found the emotional negativity of British Buddhism quite shocking. The psychic atmosphere at the Hampstead Buddhist Vihara was worse than anything he had previously encountered. A couple of years later, British Buddhism was riven with dissension over the rights of a bhikkhu to shake off the burden of other men's projections and be free to lead a life authentically attuned to the complex conditions of Western life and thought.
The period with Carter and the mystics and others was quite idyllic and very liberating for me, in tune with the mood of the times. It was the first time in my life that I'd had an opportunity of this kind. It was a very rich, fruitful, creative period, and I had a lot of energy that expressed itself in all sorts of ways, including the sexual, as well as in Dharma talks, poetry, etc.
During the 1960s, Sangharakshita had been invited to the little Buddhist groups dotted about England. An old friend now invited him to give his first talks in continental Europe.
At the beginning of January, I spent 4 days in Paris, giving lectures, meeting Buddhists, and spending time with my old friend Thich Chien Chow.
The Vietnamese monk had stayed with Sangharakshita in Kalimpong and in London.
I saw a good deal of Paris, visiting a number of places of cultural and historical interest. I then spent 2 days as the guest of Antoinette Wilmot, who was translating a survey of Buddhism into French. I come to you with 4 gifts. The first gift is a lotus flower, Do you understand? My second gift is a golden net. Can you recognize it? My third gift is a shepherd's round dance. Do your feet know how to dance? My fourth gift is a garden planted in a wilderness. Could you work there? I come to you with 4 gifts. Dare you accept them?
Subhuti invited us back to his parents' place. One day I remember we dropped some acid and we sort of were meandering around the house during the course of the day, and it was a fantastic experience. And then in the evening I can remember we gathered around in the sitting room, sitting on the floor. But anyway, we formed what we called the League of Court Lodge. I think we signed some sort of paper, that we would form this sort of secret league and that we'd do something with this Buddhism.
You're tuned to the General Overseas Service of the BBC. This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Bhante had been asked, what would you do if a hippie came into the centre? And Bhante said, well, I'd invite them downstairs and teach them to meditate. So although I wasn't really a hippie, I had long hair and dabbled in drugs. So I thought, this is a man for me, somebody who's sympathetic to all of that, not going to be moralistic or whatever. I was extremely pleased when I saw him in his manifestation at that time, with long hair and rings on his fingers and a slightly disreputable air to him. I really liked that.
The FWBO started in a tiny basement underneath a shop. 7 or 8 of us used to meet just once a week on a Thursday evening for meditation, and then we went home. Those of us who had a home, of course. I didn't, being a monk.
He greeted me as if he'd known me all his life. "Hello," he said, looking straight into me. I said I'd come to learn to meditate. He informed me that was actually the order night. "But you can stay if you want." I said, no, I couldn't possibly do that. No. And he said, "What, a bit too much perhaps?"
The 4th batch of ordinations took place at Keffel's at the end of a popular summer retreat. The following year, one couple arrived by motorbike.
But the first part was led by other order members. I remember Dhruva. Brenda was her name. I can't remember her order name, actually.
It was the Eightfold Path series. It was so clear what he put in the tapes. The fact that he was English, the fact that he understood Western psychology, he obviously understood Buddhism. They were common sense, but also you could feel there was depth as well. So that, being quite clever, intellectual, into study and so on, I did respond to that as well.
There'd be a period discussion. Bhante would answer questions.
I did know that Bhante did pre-ordination classes, so I was about to do them. And I remember at the end of one of those retreats saying to him that I wanted to join that class, so I knew that I wanted to be ordained, though I knew I wasn't ready, but I did see that as definite preparation for ordination. So I suppose I had begun to see it as a going for refuge, which was central to it all.
About 1967, I was going to group therapy, and Kevin was one of the people in that group. We liked each other, and so we started meeting up. And in fact, we became best friends. In a way, he was the first friend I had in London, and he was a real godsend, actually, he really was. And I think I was for him as well, I used to call him Swami for some reason. I had a number of kind of meetings with Bhante, not personal, not one-to-one meetings, but usually with Kevin. We used to meet different places, sometimes at Bhante's flat, sometimes in cafes or coffee bars. I don't remember actually liking Bhante very much. Just one of these things, it's hard to say why really, but and the only thing I remember of that conversation was me asking him if he was enlightened. Leading question, of course, and he just said no, just a simple no, which didn't disappoint me or enthrall me or anything. It was just, okay, that's what he said, fine.
Take people for walks and just listening more and more to him, sort of giving sort of practical Dharma. And it was very encouraging to people to open up and communicate with one another. I found those communication exercises were a very powerful thing.
He was completely fearless. That's the impression one had, and not at all constrained by convention.
It's like a bodhisattva supposed to give the quality of fearlessness, and I think in a sense that is exactly what Bhante did. I always felt incredibly safe. It was like something you could just completely relax. Well, say that, I mean at times I got quite tense, especially when we had to do communication exercises, which I hated at that time. But there was another quality there which enabled me to do those communication exercises, which if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have been able to do. I would have run away. There was a whole sort of atmosphere of trust and security.
The exercises were derived from the work of Sangharakshita's friend, Muriel Payne, whom he had met in Bombay. She had been a headmistress in South India in the 1950s, and though unqualified and rather illiterate, she was resourceful. She had devised the exercises, spiced with some Tibetan rigour, to address her teachers' and pupils' inability to communicate with one another.
Nowhere in the Buddhist tradition do you find discussion of what could be called pure communication that is not about anything. During those exercises, I experienced communication as I had never done before, especially when I did the exercises with Muriel Payne. Miss Payne was not a highly educated person. She did not have a good accent, but she was cheerful and down to earth, and was in many ways a remarkable woman to whom the FWBO owes some gratitude.
The exercises enhanced communication. Could taking mind-altering drugs do the same for consciousness?
The time came when I had been asked that sort of question so many times and had given my reply, so many times, so to speak, from the book, that I felt I ought to be able to speak more from experience.
Kevin and I swallowed a moderate quantity of a blue powder and awaited results.
Rick and I think we just stayed in the flat. Bhante and Kevin went off together.
Everything now seemed diaphanous. As the universe unfolded came a wondrous sound, Om. An hour passed and Om changed to yes. Yes, yes, we said, in one blissful affirmation of existence. Yes. Later that day I flew to New York.
Was very successful in Yale. His lectures were absolutely crowded out, and he made some very good friends, and they used to do things like the communication exercises. There just seemed to be that ease of communication between men.
Some of the students succeeded in experiencing authentic human communication to an almost transcendental degree. As I remarked after the exercises, I felt as though I was in charge of a herd of stampeding young bulls.
During Sangharakshita's second term, a planned mixed class was dropped when riots broke out on campus.
New York was New York. Everything was on a bigger scale than anywhere else, and a sense of excitement filled the air. Dan, with whom I was staying, acted as my companion and guide, from Wall Street to Greenwich Village, and from the Metropolitan Museum of Art to Max Surley's.
Two kinds, light and dark.
And nothing in the place has changed. Nothing. They hang a picture, it stays there for 100 years or longer.
On my last evening, Dan and his brother Steve and I spent a couple of hours sitting on a rock in Central Park. All around us, like petals around the calyx of a gigantic flower, half a dozen skyscrapers, brilliantly lighted up, rose hundreds of stories above us, into the sky.
Bante went down with pneumonia, and that happened very shortly after the retreat started, right at the beginning of the retreat. And he was quite very sick. In fact, he died in a sense on that retreat, and was sort of leaving. But Kevin was with him, and Kevin said, "Don't leave, we need you."
I can't say really what it was, except that I was, so to speak, out of my body, and it was very clear to me then that I didn't mind whether I sort of came back into it, whether I lived or whether I died. I was quite indifferent about that. It didn't seem to matter very much either way. But when he, spoke as he did, it was as though the balance ever so slightly tilted, and I felt ready to come back. But I didn't really mind either way at all. But from that moment, I felt energy flow back into me, and I started to get better.
On the first retreat I went on, he'd just come back almost straight from America, and apparently caught pneumonia. After 2 or 3 days, we were sort of told that Bante was better now, and that if there's anybody who had to leave the retreat, who wanted to meet him, wanted to see him, they could do so. He was in bed. He had this great big grin. It was very disarming. I couldn't really quite work out what to do or say. Again, I was very nervous, but he seemed to think that was quite funny. So again, he made a very strong impact on me. And apparently, just a couple of days before that, he'd virtually died.
The experience left me with permanent impressions. I'm convinced that dying is, or at least can be, a pleasant rather than an unpleasant experience. I also feel that I may not have as much time in which to finish my work as I had perhaps previously supposed, and that it therefore behoves me to make the best possible use of every hour still remaining to me. In comparison with what I had experienced in the States, everything seemed smaller in scale, and people seemed less interested in things, less enthusiastic, less alive. Nevertheless, I did not despair, and by way of both precept and example, strove to infuse new life and energy into the movement. Having lived in the same flat for more than 3 years, I wanted a change. By the autumn, Kevin, Graham and I were living as a mini-community.
Kevin, a third-year art student at St Martin's College of Art, attended classes during the day and worked on his thesis, Art and the Higher Evolution, in the evening. Graham divided his time between a part-time hospital job and classes at the North London College of Further Education, receiving an education no one from his background thought possible.
I did a foundation course, which was 1 year, then I did a BA, which is 3 years, then I did a postgraduate, which is another 1 year, so that was 5 years. But I couldn't pay the rent, so Bante was carrying the rent. Come Easter or summer, I could get a job, money, and paid him back. He was really supportive of what I was trying to do, i.e. get an education.
The movement suffered a tremendous blow when the lease on Sakura, the centre for all FWBO activities, expired.
As the weeks went by, it seemed that we were losing more and more people because we didn't have our own place.
It was very much a room hired once a week on a temporary basis while we looked for somewhere else. Big highlights were the retreats, the Easter and summer retreats, where you had about 80 people.
Siddhiratna's film captures the exuberance on which Sangharakshita was heard to remark, how easily people seem to lose their mindfulness, even under conditions highly favourable to spiritual life. On an earlier Kefald's retreat, Gautami encouraged people to form a community at Sarum House. 3 years later, it was failing.
I'd lived in lots of institutional homes and orphanages and foster homes and things, and this was the first time I'd actually sort of intentionally gone into something like that.
It was always a mixed community, and very quickly cross relationships were established, which caused quite a lot of jealousy and friction as relationships broke apart and people left. And so, because rent had to be paid, they started to invite members from other Buddhist groups or other individual Buddhists to join the community.
You know, teachers were coming, other people were inviting their teachers, and we were inviting our teachers. And at one time there were Tibetans and Thai Buddhists and Zen Buddhists.
You know, I've heard other people later talking about that period as a very messy sort of period, but I didn't actually find it that way. I found it was quite a stimulating period.
It was difficult. I mean, it was a melting pot, because we were trying to live a life, a human life there, while all this was going on. With hindsight, it was a really stupid thing to do in a way, because we hadn't really got a tradition.
It was really as a result of that I think Bhante decided that we had to form our own movement, because just different ways of practicing, you couldn't really do it together.
We learnt a lot from it, but it was a high cost, you know. A lot of damage was done as well. People were quite hurt.
On the first anniversary of the Order's founding, Sangharakshita ordained Warren Atkins from the Nottingham Buddhist Society as Akshobhya. Shortly afterwards, he moved to New Zealand.
He'd started a number of groups over there. He'd stuck very, very strictly to what he'd been taught by Bhante. And he asked Bhante many times if he would come out there, because he felt, you know, they'd gone to the limit of his knowledge. And Bhante still wasn't able to go. And so he said to me, well, I think it's about time somebody went, and it'd better be you. So I, oh, my goodness me, you know. He said, you know what to do. So I went. It's a fantastic group of people out there. Very eager, just ready to blossom, like the flowers.
Sangharakshita, with the full-time help of Buddhadasa, spent a year looking for a new centre. Finally, Camden Council offered them a temporary lease on a condemned dairy and piano factory for a peppercorn rent.
It did cross my mind that it's going to be too much to take on, because, well, not only was it, or had it been neglected, it was also derelict. Windows were broken, inside had been torn apart, and really all we had was just two spaces upstairs and downstairs. And I remember Bhante just turning to me and said, well, do you think you could do it? And I said, well, I'll give it a go. Within days of moving there, we had our first meditation class. And class was very quickly up and running.
I went to Balmore Street to see what was happening. And there were classes there, and talks as well, and people were lovely. You could talk to them. So that was very enjoyable. I got to know people better, and I met Maharishi, for instance. I remember Anama.
So it was on a Wednesday evening after the beginners class, so there was a meditation and then tea break, and then they'd play lectures. So I remember listening to the Bodhisattva Ideal series quite early on, not really knowing what they were about, but really enjoying them. People talked about him a lot. He was rather this mysterious figure in the background. Yes, and I listened to tape lectures, but it was some time before I met him. In fact, I only really met him properly once before I was ordained. I went along and had a very simple question to ask him, the sort of question that nowadays any order member would answer. But basically, I was saying to him that I found it very difficult to concentrate on my meditation. That I found I said it was as if part of me didn't take seriously what I was trying to do. And he said, well, as we're sitting here talking, as I'm sitting here talking with you, I just get the feeling there's only half of you here with me talking. And then he said, well, no, it's, just a quarter of you here talking. And then he said, no, it's like just a tenth of you here talking to me. There's only a tenth of you here in this room with me. So that, in a way, that's why you can't meditate. There's so much of you that's just not there to engage with the practice. And it had a huge effect, because it's like as he was saying it, I could just feel myself like a half, quarter, tenth, and then when I left, he said something very positive. He shook my hand, I think, and I think he said, well, if you just keep practicing, you'll gain enlightenment. I mean, he says something very profound, and I walked out the door, and I mean, within minutes I felt, actually at first I felt furious. I thought, who is this person? He doesn't know me at all, and how dare he say, there's only a tenth of me here with him, and what does he know? But he'd obviously just got right in, right under, and I suppose basically I was blocked.
This happens, of course, to quite a number of people in the course of their life. They never really feel or never really find any positive or creative outlet for their emotions, whether in relation to creative work or in connection with people, and so on. So for this reason, they suffer from emotional frustration and disappointment, and this leads to emotional blockage.
But that had a big effect on me. Basically, I started to unblock my energy. It just roused the depths, and out of that I asked for ordination.
Ordination was significant in itself, and also a manifestation of a principle that underlay all Buddhist practice, as Sangharakshita explained.
We're individuals, we're human beings who go for refuge. We go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. And to begin with, so far as our own movement is concerned, there was only myself. And gradually, other people came along.
The experience with which the history of my going for refuge begins took place as a result of my reading the Diamond Sutra. The truth taught by the Buddha in the sutra was the highest truth of Buddhism, so far as that truth can be expressed in words. The truth of shunyata, or voidness.
The way I came into relationship with him was through his teaching of the Dhamma, which I engaged with very, very strongly. Mainly after I was ordained, I very occasionally drive him. Lokamitra usually drove, but sometimes he wasn't available. I remember, especially on one occasion, coming back to the community we lived in, where Bhante was going to stay, 5 Balmoral Street, and just starting to ask him questions, sitting in the front seat of a deux chevaux, and asking him questions about the wheel of life and about conditionality, and quizzing him. And I remember the Dhamma just falling into place in my mind, and he clearly loved it. He was really enjoying it. Somebody engaging very strongly in the Dhamma. We must have sat there for an hour. Eventually I think I broke it off, saying, "Oh, you better go in."
In 1973, the FWBO had been in existence for 6 years. I therefore decided that it was high time I took a sabbatical. It was not that I was tired of giving lectures or teaching meditation or leading retreats, but rather that I felt the need to give expression to my deeper creative energies.
Before he could leave on sabbatical, Sangharakshita needed to clear some space. He had been invited to lead a retreat in Holland for Vajra Yogini and her therapist colleagues.
And right at the last moment, Bhante felt that the weight of his momentum towards being more of a hermit was so strong that he couldn't do the retreat. He just needed to go on retreat by himself. So he said to Vajrayogini in my presence, Vajradhaka will lead it, looking at me. And I was totally amazed. I'd never led a class or done anything like that. And I said, "Well, do you think I can do it?" And he said, "Yes, you can."
A dozen therapists on retreat was never going to be easy. Fortunately, halfway through, they allowed Vajradhaka to lead them. Sangharakshita was free to leave London and take his sabbatical. Mark, Kevin's workmate, a skilled carpenter and new community member, would join him. Malini had spent the last 2 years living in a cliff-edge chalet in Cornwall. The rent was affordable. Mark would build a sailing dinghy, and Sangharakshita could work on the memoirs he'd started in India.
When I was meditating, especially when I was doing the Metta Bhavana,
I actually experienced myself as being surrounded by all the order members. Not that I was just thinking of them, but they were actually there. So that made me realize that the link between us was not just a physical one. It existed on another subtler level.
He seemed very, very subtle and ethereal, almost as if he wasn't quite there, but at the same time a very, very strong presence, as if he was more sort of part of the wind and the waves and the sky. Very, very strong impression. Again, very scary.
Bhante was due to give a lecture. It had been organised and he couldn't go. So he said to me, "You better go." And I wrote the lecture in the train on the way up and I gave it. I've no idea now what it was about, but the group of people in Glasgow thereafter invited me to stay. So after I'd been to New Zealand, I went back to Glasgow. I just carried on doing in Glasgow what we'd been doing in London.
We had been very inspired by Bhante and Bhante's teaching. Osho Bodhi was ordained in 1972. I was ordained in 1973. And I managed to be invited to an Udana seminar, which was very nice with Bhante.
We were all invited down to this seminar in Cornwall in a tent. So that was just wonderful, being with Bhante, a very small number.
After 6 months, I had completed my memoirs and was in correspondence with the publisher. I decided to celebrate the event by holding a seminar for a few order members. Discussion must have ranged far and wide, but one question I still remember: what can we change within the FWBO? I was shocked to think that although only 7 years old, an order member was already thinking in terms of changing it. I replied, everything can be changed, except the going for refuge, the fundamental principle from which all the doctrines and methods of the FWBO were derived. My teaching of Dharma as doctrine is essentially based upon teachings that go back to the Buddha himself, and I explicitly exclude whatever ideas are incompatible with them. I see the teaching of Pratitya Samutpada as most basic, and from it follow the teachings of the Four Noble Truths, the 12 and 24 Nidanas, and also the teachings concerning Nirvana, Anatman, and Shunyata.
Jeremy, Lokamitra as he became, organised a 4-week retreat at his father's house, led not by Sangharakshita, but by other order members.
Ananda, Vajradhaka, Padmaraja were there, and I think it was Ashwajit arriving. The way they greeted him was with such joy, and this was the sort of relationship that I really sort of wanted more than anything else in my life. And then a day later, Bhante and Mark arrived for 2 days. And Bhante was just sitting there with his cup of tea. And I realized this was my teacher. In the late 60s, I'd understood that one needed a teacher, a guru. I never found a guru, so it just left me. And then suddenly, looking at Bhante that day, here's my teacher. It just struck me.
Subhuti was the chairman, Lokamitra was the treasurer, and Dhammadinna was the secretary.
Stormy. Very good, very intense, but it was stormy sometimes between Subhuti, Lokamitra and I. I mean, very strong personalities, very strong ideas.
At that time, it always come to some kind of resolution. And it was great working relationship, difficult, but great.
I remember running a jumble sale, the first jumble sale. I organised that, and I remember I could see Bhante was watching me. He thought, yeah, as if he was sort of saying, oh yeah, this is somebody who can do something.
The first single-sex community came about under Sangharakshita's guidance.
In this country you don't use the term older brother much, but a respected friend, someone
you could be very open to, but you're respected, but you could say anything to. So I think Dave Mitra and I got talking, and Bhante would encourage us to sort of start a men's community, and I think probably Dave Mitra shared my thing. We not particularly attracted to that, but in the end, we did it.
What does one mean by the Tantric path?
After one of Sangharakshita's talks about Tantric Buddhism, Deva Mitra and Loka Mitra squatted an empty property and started a men's community. They were both ordained when 27 order members came together at Aryatara for a first convention, and significantly, theirs were the first ordination in 2 years. The order was not an institution or society and had no legal status whatever. Individual members practiced the training principle of non-harm, ahimsa, and strove to act in the love mode as opposed to the power mode, especially during a busy time. By 1974, there were some 30 active members of the order in Britain, Finland, and New Zealand.
I came across the group that Akshobhya was running in Auckland. It wasn't what we'd call a centre. In his front living room, every Sunday afternoon, he'd run a tape lecture and then do a sevenfold puja. That's all he did for years.
It's possible, the Buddha says, to communicate by means of robes, food, water, gardens, magical incarnations, empty space, and lights in the sky. It's possible to communicate, the Buddha also says, through silence.
This was just fantastic material for me. It completely opened up the world of myth in a positive sense. I thought, this man's onto something in a way I'd not met with any other Buddhist teacher, and I had been involved with Buddhism for quite a few years by then. I thought, this man's of a completely different calibre.
It was inevitable that the Archway Centre would be demolished. Before leaving London, Sangharakshita described the 3 properties the movement would be needing. 1, a country centre suited to his literary work. 2, a permanent London centre. And 3, a home for the Order Library.
I'd often felt the need for a place of my own. Buddhadasa gave me what was then a large sum of money, and with it I bought a cottage on the outskirts of the tiny village of Castle Acre, so called because it was situated beside the ruins of a medieval castle.
I had images of Greece, and then I asked Bhante once, how come it's called Albemarle? And he said it's because the previous owners were called Albert and Mary. And that's one of several communications where my over-imagination was brought down to earth, Albert and Mary.
Yeah, they're quite nice and friendly to be against. If they were going into Swaffham, they'd say, is there anything you want? Yes. Yeah, they had a van, I know. He built a boat or something while he was here.
Mr. Chairman and friends, for the last few days I've been staying not in Auckland itself, I've been staying up in the Waitakere Hills.
Bhante then arrived, and of course he then started leading seminars, as he called them. We worked through some chapters in the 3 Jewels. The chapter on the goal of enlightenment and the human condition, it completely put me into an altered state. I felt I understood what reality was, and this man had shown it to me, etc., etc.
In the course of 3 months in New Zealand, Sangharakshita gave public talks, taught meditation, and ordained a number of people, one of them being Mark, who before they had long been in the country, had asked to be ordained.
Obviously, they were both very happy. They were completely at ease. It was very pleasant to be with them again, because I'd previously I'd visited them at Albemarle. So it was good to see them both again.
Bante and Mark were very excitedly talking about it, and that they would be moving in there together. I perceived him as getting something substantial from the relationship, which was very disappointing to see his sort of reframing it as being under duress in some form. So that's not my experience of it.
I think they had an organ when they were in there.
I certainly didn't have an organ there. I think this must be regarded as an example of the sort of myths that do sometimes accumulate around my life. I would have very much liked to have had an organ. I've always had the desire to play a musical instrument, especially perhaps the organ, but I've never had the opportunity to do so, and certainly I didn't have an organ, not even a very small one, in my cottage at Castle Acre. Did sometimes have visitors who stayed for 1 or 2 days.
Coming up from London, 21-year-old Graham stayed for dinner.
It was an Italian meal and it was really, really tasty, very enjoyable. Somebody commented recently, well, how many people can say that Bante has cooked a meal for them? Anyway, at the end of the meal, I said to Bante how enjoyable it was and how tasty the food was. And then I asked him, when was he next coming down to the community in London? You know, with sort of like suggesting he cooked us a meal in the community in London. But I didn't actually say those words. I didn't say those words. No, heaven forbid. Anyway, quick as a flash, Bante says, well, when I come to London, I expect to be taken out for a meal. And I said to Bante how much I admired him and would like to be more like him. And what could I do to be, you know, to become more like him? And there was a pause and I thought, wow, Bante could say anything now. He could say, what, you know, just whatever. But his reply was quite interesting. He said, take opportunities when they arise. And the example he gave was when he was living in Kalimpong. He was asked to manage the taking around of Sariputra and Moggallana's relics. And he said to me, I'd never managed anything in my life before. But he took that opportunity when it arose.
We put a lot of effort into raising money and looking for a new centre. Lokamitra did the money raising, I did the looking for a new centre. And we were determined to try to get out of the hippie mode, as it were. We felt that we were quite stuck in the alternative society.
The name was very off-putting, it was slightly Victorian, and it was Padmaraja opened the door. And in a way, he confirmed my worst fears, you know, that it was hippies. And they started playing the Eightfold Path series of tape lectures. I don't think I understood very much of the lecture, but I understood that this man knew what he was talking about, which were making an impression on me, but the context wasn't.
Aloka expressed his reservations when he visited Subhuti at Maitri Vihara.
And I was saying that I found it all a bit twee, really, apart from Bante's tapes. But the thing about Subhuti was, you see, it was the first time for a very long time that I'd had the experience of someone actually listening to me. Really, in retrospect, an absolute lifesaver.
And here comes the headmaster.
But eventually, we found this old fire station and it was an absolute wreck. And that seemed to be just what we needed. In the end, it turned out we needed about £250,000 and 3.5 years of work. As Bante said, it's a good thing we didn't know.
apparently they worked it out on the back of a fag packet that it was going to, you know, take something like 15,000 or something.
It was all black, and it was like a Tarkovsky movie without the water dripping out of the ceiling, but it was so, so grim.
You went through the building floor by floor, did you, the first time?
We went right the way through the whole thing. This was the bottom floor was totally burnt out in incredibly run down state, because it had been used as a playground by kids, and I think there had been, I don't know how many fires. And as you went up to the first floor, all the joists on the first floor had been burnt, and the floors were mainly up. So it wasn't very safe, you know, sort of being there in the place either. And generally, as you went up, I think it'd been standing for about 5 years, I think. So it was pretty cold and bleak, and well, there was more missing in it than there was actually there.
Even what was there was riddled with dry rot. Work began with a team of 6 men, expanding to 12. Sangharakshita stayed a couple of times in the first year, and on his second visit, blessed the fire station with a new name. Sukhavati, Abode of Bliss.
What I remember most of all about my stay is the literary work I was doing.
What particularly fired me up was the Bodhisattva ideal, because 3 or 4 weeks before I was ordained, Bhante held the first of his seminars on the Bodhicharyavatara.
Padmaloka, that was my idea, in a way. I was living in Norfolk with David Mitchell initially, and I'd gone up there to find a retreat centre in Norfolk.
Vajrakumara, ex-Mark, worked as a carpenter at Sukhavati and planned to rent a country property for men's retreats.
Then Vajrakumara inherited money, and there was a possibility of buying somewhere. So he and I toured Norfolk together, and indeed we found a building that became Padmaloka, and he purchased it.
The purchase went through in May, with Vajrakumara's inheritance giving him an 82% share, and Sangharakshita's sale of Albemarle an 18% share in the joint ownership. When they moved in July, they ceased having sexual relations. Vajrakumara built boats, and Sangharakshita turned his attention elsewhere.
It was, of course, the period when I was getting settled down, so to speak, at Padmaloka and forming the community there. And that took up a lot of my time and attention and was very important.
It was Vajrakumara and myself, initially just the two of us in the building. He was hyper anxious. I spent much of my time listening to his anxieties. He then felt better, and I ended up feeling anxious. That was my sort of role to begin with.
Over the course of the following month, we were joined by a number of other men. Some were interested in studying the Dharma, or exploring community life, or simply being with me.
It was loosely intended to be a men's retreat centre, but what this actually involved, it was also the order office. And we had to try and be aware of Bhante's needs. And I think there was also, right from the beginning, a tension between these two functions at Padmaloka, and also tension between Vajrakumara and the rest of the community, because Vajrakumara, although he helped purchase Padmaloka, was very much not part of Padmaloka as a community. He had his own life, his own interests. After we'd been there a few months, we got the candle factory up and running. That was actually quite a lot of fun, because everybody pulled together on that project, even Vajrakumara. And for a while we were actually making some money.
Facility quickly could become a Devaloka. There were some fabulous retreats quite early on. You know, We've moved on a lot since then, but they set a very good beginning. Still quite early days really for men's retreats, and there were some excellent times.
A memorable series of 8 talks in Hampstead brought Vajra Kumara and Sangharakshita down to London.
It was a Sutra of Golden Light lecture series that was held at Hampstead Town Hall. And it was quite magical because for a series of 8 weeks, every week, I think maybe 50 of us would just walk across the heath, listen to this lecture, and then, we'd come back at night and, there'd be the stars in the sky and the moon, and we'd listen to this sutra and we'd be talking about it. And it was like entering another realm, really, that we'd enter listening to the sutra, and then you'd come back and you'd have the lights of London, or this sense of, the possibility of transforming the world, really. Because that lecture series does have quite a lot in it about the world and the Dharma, transforming the world. So it was the beginning of, that vision of what was possible, really. It was bigger than just living in these squats in Balmoor Street.
I felt there was something very positive, something much more definitely spiritual, and a feeling of brotherhood, and the whole spirit of Sangha seems to have been intensified in that sort of situation.
Whenever Bhante lived there, the door was always open for me to go in.
Bhante is my best friend, yeah. That's how I see it. I'm aware he's best friends with many, many other people, though, and that is a really healthy thing. It's really healthy.
Subhuti's closeness to Sangharakshita had developed along different lines.
First of all, in discussion of the Dhamma, and then in acting to create the movement according to his vision and in dialogue with him. And we're working very closely with him for several years at Pamaloka as his secretary. And not very much personal.
This became clearer at the end of a retreat held in Scotland for the Sakavati builders from London.
I was just about to leave, and I had a feeling of dissatisfaction, of unhappiness, that in some way I felt I hadn't connected with him. I suppose I was carrying quite a big burden here with the building project, and I couldn't really talk to many people about that, and I'd sort of hoped to talk to him, but it didn't happen. I was standing, he walked up and down in front of me, which he'd sometimes do, and he said something like, "It's strange. There are people you can have a personal friendship with," or something like that, "and there are people you can work with, and they're not usually the same." So he somehow picked up what was going on with me, because he's very, very acute, and he'd given me an answer of a sort which sort of did satisfy me. It meant that he'd understood what was going on, and I thought, well, at least I can work with him.
As the 10th anniversary of the FWBO approached, Sangharakshita took a 3-month writing break on a Scottish island with Subhadra.
Well, he said, could I be his companion, sort of thing? And so we'd go out for walks, and there was an intimate aspect to the relationship. And also I'd drive him here and there. I got a bit claustrophobic, I got tired of the whole thing after about 18 months, but it just took the merest hint of that for him to say, fine, there was no clinging and no recriminations, so very positive on that side of things. But it is nice to feel you're special to somebody and they're special to you. And he's a very loyal chap.
Quite early in life, he cut himself off from the group. He left his parents, left his wife and child, left his city, left his tribe. In the Buddha's time, in the Buddha's day, the part of the group was not so very great compared
with what it is nowadays. But all the same, the Buddha's teaching was needed. The Buddha's example was needed. It's needed, in fact, we may say, whenever there's an imbalance between the individual and the group, especially when that imbalance is as extreme as it is today in the West, as it is in the world today.
Lokamitra had spent 4 months in India practicing yoga, visiting the holy sites, and meeting Sangharakshita's old friends. He then spent 6 months being tutored by Sangharakshita in preparation for a lifetime in India.
We were talking every day. His plans were just sort of flowering, and he was sharing so much past experience with me and guiding me and so on, and helping me to understand things. Every day we would talk. The locals thought it was a gay wedding because I was wearing my robes, and I only heard this later on.
I think we left England on Padmasambhava Day, a very auspicious day. We arrived here, we stayed in a lodge, Kularatna and myself, and Padmavajra joined us shortly afterwards, and we just went into a very, very heavy program of classes. I think at times 14 classes a week between us, at least Padmavajra and I, or talks in different parts of Pune. We had a couple of retreats, but the response was just tremendous.
A Christian lady used to take her car out of her garage for Sunday prayers, and we used to have classes.
How many people did we used to get in the class?
Inside about 50 or 20 people used to sit inside.
Yeah. All these positive people, bubbling with energy. I felt that they have found something and they want to give it to me.
My first few months were dedicated to setting things up for his first visit.
लोखंडे नावाचा विद्यार्थी होता. त्यांनी मला असं सांगितलं की आमच्याकडे त्रैलोक्य बौद्ध महासंघाचे वर्ग आत्ता सुरू झाले काल परवा. आणि त्या दरम्यान काय झालं की भंते महास्थर संघरक्षित हे 6 डिसेंबरच्या प्रवचनाला दापोडीला आले. म्हणजे मी बाबासाहेबाच्या जातीत जन्माला आल्याच्या नंतरही मला बाबासाहेब एवढ्या चांगल्या प्रकारे समजले नाही. भंतेंनी म्हणजे इतकं चांगलं बाबासाहेबांच्या जीवनाबद्दल कसं काय हे केलं. पहिल्यांदा असं वाटलं की आपण या चळवळीत टिकलं पाहिजे, राहिलं पाहिजे.
There was a pipe coming through in the basement with a bit of water, and that was the extent of the plumbing. There was an outside cold shower, there was an outside toilet which worked. Luckily it was June and it was hot, so we camped out in the garden and ate in the garden and things.
Establishing Amaravati, a 17-room women's community in East London, began as a feeling. A year or so earlier, women order members and mitras, few in number and with few natural friendships, felt they were being left behind by the men. They raised their concerns on the Third Order Convention. Sangharakshita's response was firm.
Bhante made his famous statement, which was, I think the women are going to feel pushed aside for a few years, and quite frankly, I think it will be good for them. So it was a bit of a challenge, really, for us to be more independent. It sparked us off to go and do something together.
They formed a council and began fundraising for a women's community and retreat centre. Work at Sukhavati ground to a halt as funds ran dry. The men looked elsewhere for work or enjoyed the long, hot summer of 76.
Something that quite shocked me when I moved up from Croydon was that it seemed Bhante and Subhuti were convinced that Sukhavati needed to be a strong men's spiritual community, which I actually took quite a strong exception to. I came from Croydon, where we'd lived on top of the centre, and the whole strength of the centre had been that here were these people who lived there, who they got to know. I mean, I had this more democratic, mixed attitude towards things.
The Aryatara community and centre had expanded into nearby Croydon, and was running some businesses. The community excelled at giving classes led by a legendary team.
These 4 order members, Nalga Bodhi, Vasantra, Jyotipala, Padmaraja, these were like the bearers of the Dharma to me. I mean, I didn't meet Sangharakshita for quite a while yet. And I can remember one evening noting that if this was some cult, how they should have become uniform, and we, the public, should have seemed distinct from each other, but it was quite the reverse. We seemed more like a flock.
It was Sleepy Hollow at that time as a centre. There was very, very little going on there at all. And I mean, within certainly 18 months, we'd gone from, as I say, this centre which I'd moved to because it was Sleepy Hollow and a nice quiet place to meditate, to something which had a number of right livelihood businesses, which had tremendously full classes, lots of people engaged, tremendous amount of energy, and a very full, demanding, challenging situation.
These days I find myself much more open to questioning my assumption at the time that Bhante just did not understand what running a public centre was about.
The spiritual community does not have to justify its existence to the world. It does not have to show that it brings about social and economic improvements, that it is helpful to the government or the administration. It is good for the world that such a thing as the spiritual community should simply be there. Good that there should be people around who are dedicated to the spiritual life, dedicated to the development of skillful states of mind. Whatever they do quite freely. They do it because they want to, as part of the process of their own spiritual development.
My background before the movement had been quite political, and I'd really been looking for some method of changing the world, and I'd realised you couldn't do that without individuals having a commitment to change. And Ajita answered the telephone and said, "Oh, just come now. Come up now and have some dinner." It was the opening of the Glasgow Centre, and it was a 7-fold puja. There were readings between every section, chants that I've never heard since. I don't know where they came from. And it lasted for ever such a long time. Vajramala and I were the only 2 women, about 15 or 16 men, and we just really wondered what on earth was going on.
Oh, Jinya, Chulna, Champsam, Pemagisal, Dangbola, all that kind of stuff. Boom, 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 boom. Great.
But that period was very difficult when it was during the point when the men were trying to strengthen their community, trying to strengthen, I suppose, their identity as a Sangha. And it really wasn't awfully skillfully done. I think it would be fair to say in retrospect.
For the first, though by no means the last time in my life, did I have an obscure sense of some mysterious destiny shaping my ends.
Sangharakshita had taken the opportunity the army had provided to adopt India as his spiritual home. Having left the merchant navy, Dana Vira returned to Glasgow and joined a new kind of gang.
The conditioning in Scotland and in Glasgow in the 50s and 60s wasn't very good. It wasn't very supportive for psychological and emotional strength. Most people did not walk out of that conditioning feeling, isn't life good?
106 miles to Chicago. We got a full tank of gas, half a pack of cigarettes, it's dark, and we're wearing sunglasses.
Out of the confusion of our experience comes this man who is in touch with himself, who is integrated more than us at least, who's got something he can say, who can speak confidently about life. And that, I think, was one of the best things that, Bhante could do for people like me in my position. It was possible to live a life and make it some sort of meaning and significance out of it. So we became Haruka. Ajita told me that Bhante had suggested that name.
We're on a mission from God.
The thing was, we enjoyed it. We felt that we were on a mission.
Everybody who was a mitra, everybody who was involved to any extent, did things in the centre in Glasgow. It was very much the ethos, which I think was a lot to do with Ajita.
It was during that period, as was the height of the blasphemy against women, took place.
I think I felt that I was in tune with basically the basic FWBO's stance in all of this. But unfortunately, what happened was I had personal psycho-emotional needs. I gave this talk, and at the end of it, all the women in the Mitras abandoned ship. They all left Glasgow. It was my fault. All the women finally decided they'd had enough. I was a young man trying to leave mother and being afraid of women and not wanting to be sucked into the samsaric life, because that's, you know, that's what women want. They want to take your energy and pull it inside them and stuff like this.
Like with a lot of the phases that the group element of the movement goes through, it's not always very sophisticated. Perhaps some really quite hurtful things did happen. I don't think we could have done without it, though. And I think it was pretty inevitable that that was the form it took. I mean, it would have been lovely if the men and women could have all been enlightened and dealt with this extraordinarily crucial element of our conditioning in a way that didn't hurt, that didn't make anyone feel left out, etc. I mean, I don't see how it could have happened otherwise.
Sangharakshita taught metta, love, for Christians as human beings, but warned that such feelings were not reciprocated by a theology and ethics that traded in guilt and fear. The fact that England's twin establishments, a marriage of church and state, had been crafted for mischief, had been ignored for too long. Heads could roll.
In common with most other people, Buddhists in Britain have always believed that they enjoyed complete freedom of expression in religious matters, and that punishment for such crimes as heresy and blasphemy was a thing of the past. This belief has now been rudely shattered.
The editor and publishers of the newspaper Gay News were charged with blasphemous libel, tried at the Old Bailey under judge-led law, and duly convicted.
All the prosecution did was produce a single witness whose evidence showed that the offending poem had been published and that one sympathiser with Christianity had been shocked and disgusted by it. This was sufficient to secure convictions.
As a movement, as an order, it is our duty to go out as much as we can into society and make clear the Buddhist conception of ethics, which is a healthy and a positive and a creative conception of ethics in a way that Christian ethics is not. We don't want an ethics of guilt, an ethics of fear. We want an ethics of growth and development, which is what we have in Buddhism. So I think we need to try to fill this gap, if you like. We accept the need for more ethics in our social life, but we reject the notion that those ethics have to be Christian ethics.
In the spring of 1978, 3 of Croydon's teachers were called up to finish building the London Buddhist Centre. Padmaraja was left as sole bearer of the Dharma for a group of young men and women in an increasingly complex situation.
I feel incredibly grateful to him that he really did give me, he did teach me how to talk about myself, and he did introduce me to the arts as well as to the Dharma. When we formed the first community, we just had no idea whatsoever. None of us really had any idea of how to communicate with one another. So we just got in there and we did it. And I was very idealistic. And just, you know, I just sort of moved in there, and I wanted other people to live like I wanted to live. I wasn't really have that much awareness of other people and their differences, really. There wasn't anything like reporting in those days. So we weren't taught or encouraged how to really express ourselves as if that was part of our practice. You know, to me in those days, practice was working together and meditating, really. I don't think I really had a sense of what was to come.
Suddenly you had about 7 young men all very idealistic. If a Mitra missed a beginner's class, the rest of the Mitras went to find out why. Two of us were going out one night and there was a barbed comment thrown at us from Padmaraja, you know, do they live here, or some such. And yes, you felt it, you thought, we are sinning in going out tonight. There was a pressure growing.
Sue Lawson, a Mitra, and I, when we were planning, at other people at the council's suggestion, a women's takeaway business. I remember the dealings that we had then with Padmaraja and some of the other men, just being quite, in a way, very harsh. I think that was my first experience of me as a person not being taken into consideration. It left me and Sue very, very upset. Here was some good work that we'd put into it just being cut out by somebody else having a completely different view, but not being willing to discuss it with us, but just telling us that we were wrong, and we were wrong for being reactive because we were upset, and so therefore there was no room for communication because it was our problem rather than theirs.
When I moved into London, I was very, very fired by the idea of setting up a new society and very attracted towards doing that. And I suppose I saw Amaravati in a way as part of that, really.
From what I've heard, people who've talked about it since, some people's experience, they can hardly bear to think of Amaravati, and other people think of it very fondly. It was quite an intensive experience. There was 13 of us moved into this house together. It was the first community that was closed to men.
We were trying to find our identity as women order members and Mitras, as well as women, perhaps. We'd had a lot of stuff, you know, about the individual in the group, and the individual emancipates from the group. So anything that sort of we thought was groupy, group-like, you know, ordinary affection, liking somebody, you know, was a bit kind of, well, but that's not spiritual. I grew up as a young order member with a very strong sense of division between order members and Mitras, and confidentiality and non-confidentiality, and you didn't share your weaknesses or your process with Mitras. You know, it sounds weird now, but that is how it was. That got carried through, and there's a bit of a sideline, got carried through into Croydon, that kind of very strong model of vertical Kalyana Mitratal, but you don't really kind of hang out with someone and have much, you know, ordinary human friendship. It's a bit of a distorted model, really. And I think, yeah, some of the Mitras suffered, you know, living in and amongst that, although I think they also got a lot out of it as well. But Vidyashri seems to be the one who loved it as a Mitra. She absolutely loved it.
It only lasted 2 years, but actually I think it was quite a significant point for the women in the movement.
The candle factory prospered for 8 years until it was destroyed by fire. By Sangharachita's 60th birthday, enough money had been raised to buy out Vajrakumara's share of Padmaloka. By 1989, Vajrakumara had been dropped from the order list after 12 years of campaigning against Sangharachita and the FWBO. His campaign ally, Maurice Walsh, died the same year. New Zealander Paramartha, Sangharachita's companion for 30 years, was ordained at Guhya Loka in Spain.
I made quite a strong connection with Bhante on the Guhya Loka course, partly because I think people were a little reluctant to sit next to him at dinner because he joined us for dinner, and being fresh off the boat, young, naive New Zealander, I'd slip in there and we'd chat. So there was an easy rapport, which was delightful. It was great.
It could be truly said that Sangharachita was extraordinary, not only in the extent of his friendships, but also because quite a few of them, shockingly, had the appearance of being between equals.
I think he really meant it when he said he didn't see himself as anything extraordinary. I remember the first time he said this to me, I was talking about somebody's response to not seeing so much of him anymore. And I said to him that, you know, to have been with you and then to not be so much with you is like being dropped from a very great height. He looked slightly puzzled and even slightly pained, and he said, I find that very difficult to grasp. I suppose I'm with myself all the time, so I don't think of myself as anything very extraordinary. Some people I think he related to very closely and thought that he was more in an ordinary human relationship than was actually realistic. And some people, probably such as myself, that was never a question, because I was definitely serving him. But I don't think he saw it in terms of a vertical relationship or anything like that. He just saw it as one human being with another.
When I look back on those early days and think of the difficulties I had to experience, not that I always thought of them as difficulties, I cannot but feel that the coming into existence of the Western Buddhist order was little short of a miracle.
I think she wanted to start a family, and it was her home, and so that agreement was dissolved. So that's why, for quite a long time, we didn't have a women's retreat centre. So I remember coming back from New Zealand in 1982 in the spring and being on a seminar with Bhante. So he was running seminars at Padma for women. He'd do 2 a year, very, very big, which was his way of working out if people were ready for ordination or not. And being there and being in a order meeting with him, and Bhante being very, very strong about the fact that we really needed a women's retreat centre. Padma had been going for 5 years. Okay, we hadn't, we'd lost Mandara, but we really needed to get a women's retreat centre together. I think he saw, in a way that perhaps we didn't, that that's what we needed to do. Then we set up an ordination process, and then, so he had, the vision, and he was quite pushy, I guess. But that's what we needed to do.
Every time I met him, he'd take me further, and I couldn't accept what he was saying. And by the time we next met, I'd sort of just got around to accepting what he'd been saying or becoming open to that. And then he'd go further. And I found this fascinating and infuriating and incredibly stimulating.
I think you could only talk of him in terms of a spiritual genius. Both an extraordinary erudition and very great retaining of what he'd read, extraordinary memory, and a remarkable grasp of the Dhamma from a very, very early age, and an extraordinary imaginative world, which I think was where he really lived.